Primordial, Chapter 1. It started with a knock on the door on a quiet Sunday morning, forcing me off my pleather armchair and onto my knees, which creaked with the joys of growing old. I half-limped, half-strided to the old hinging metal, the thin sheet that separated me from the outside world, fully prepared to fight the onslaught of Jehovah's Witnesses, bare-knuckled to polo-covered chest. What I saw was anything but a young college graduate ready to save my soul. Tendrils of darkness emanated from a main hull, a soft, blurry body of nothing. It warped the light around it, giving the impression of gravity, like this creature were the drain for our universe, all matter swirling towards it, slowly being sucked away. The creature reeked of something ancient, primordial, instinctive, but it gave no outward impression of malice. When I approached it, it even extended a tendril for me to shake, as if it were an overzealous neighbour here to welcome me to the district. Arms still outstretched, the formless nothing advanced slowly, warily, circling me unlike a predator in its thorough observation. It had no eyes, only a smoky gaze that you felt followed you, despite the lack of any orifice for visual input, even without an all-seeing orb, as would only be fitting for a creature as metaphysical as this was. Its eyeless mass watched like a lazy lifeguard, condescendingly vigilant. When the creature shook my hand, the touch smelt like waking from a dream, a lingering melodor that was suspiciously intangible, like a thread weaved from nothing at all. I had read myths of the ancient ones, beings before time. I was obsessed with the abstract notion of a persisting life form, floating pre-existence. If I had the words to encompass it, or a mind that could hope to understand the answer, I would ask what it felt like, what it meant to be the first. Was it lonely? Did you know? Did you know what was to come? I regarded the creature carefully, and it regarded me back. Somewhere deep within, I knew it understood me, like a well-honed tool wielded by a master craftsman. It knew something beyond what my introspection could realize. This being and I were not bound by the same restraints. My very human mortality posed a barrier from the infinite that it could manipulate. Yet, I could tell it jealously eyed my tangibility. If I were a braver man, I would ask to trade, if only for a short time. I don't know what the creature would say to such an offer, but nonetheless, a refusal would surprise me. There is a pervasive sense that it would mold entire galaxies for me if I offered it a barefoot walk on the beach, or the first taste of an ice cream on a hot summer's day. And while I don't think intangibility is torture, if intangibility is to exist as the perpetual nothing, it might as well be. Yet, despite itself, this creature had made an effort to be courteous. Though I don't know the greeting customs of the non-existent, this being had obliged my human traditions and thus made me appear inhospitable in my own 4 dimensions. Politely, as though this were a job interview and not first contact with a primordial entity, I nodded my head. "Hi, I'm Nathaniel. And you are?" I plastered a look of appeasement on my face, carefully painting over any ill expression as though I were a handyman and my face a particularly troublesome piece of drywall. There was the overwhelming impression of rumbling. Something deep and decrepit and not there at all, like the voice of a monk vowed to silence, finally breaking free in glorious roar. The not sound creeped. It creaked and groaned, straining with unuse and bowing under the weight of its unholy power. "Steve," came the low drone of unadulterated intensity. The creature, Steve as it had informed me, flattened itself to the ground in what I assumed was some kind of salute. I couldn't explain it, but a part of me was disappointed. The self-important part of my brain thought itself a power high enough to set expectations for the mighty being before me. I, in my breakable human body, found this eldritch form somehow lacking. All for the sake of a name. If yesterday someone had asked me to choose a sound that would encompass an archaic but transcendent life form, John would have been so far down my list of possible responses that supercalifragilisticexpialidocious would have been the equivalent of 6 volumes of Encyclopedia Britannica before it, and even XX gamer_girl_furry XX would have beaten it by at least 2. If someone had asked me that question as early as 10 minutes ago, John would have only been my answer after a Googleplex and a half of increasingly obscure names, probably relatively soon after Googleplex and a half itself. But as it stood in the present moment, John was in my top 3, 2 places before Mike, but just beaten out by Barry. It seemed like this glob of impenetrable power had found its name on the first page of a book entitled 100 Baby Names for Your Middle Class and Extremely Average Offspring, and I was struggling to justify why it shouldn't have. Who was I to judge any part of this creature? This being who could disintegrate me into the atoms that I was made from, then split those atoms into uncountable fractions, and divide those further until they were reduced to the abyss of nothing from whence I came. It could turn me into a hydrogen bomb just as easily as it could turn me into an umbrella stand. So who was I to undermine its preferred designation? "Steve," came the sound as I tested it on my tongue. assessing it as if I had not said the name thousands of times before, as if Steve were the fearsome and archaic sound I had originally anticipated. The name tasted like a pantomime as I performatively considered it. Ignorant, or apathetic to my personal stupor, Steve bounced from the floor into its previous position. It was impossibly round, in a definite state of matter, one imperceptibly distinguished from the other three, but difficult to appoint as to which it was. I wanted to ask why it was here, but I was worried about appearing insensitive or in some way insulting the absurd thing. Steve only blobbed with infinite patience. There was a pause of some time, only broken by my inability to endure silence, a result of my corporeal form's inadequacy when faced with forever. This inadequacy was due to the irritating human tendency to cease existing. In acknowledgement of my species' inclination for sudden and spontaneous termination, I strive not to waste the time I do have before my abrupt and inevitable end. Steve seemed to have no such issues, as I awkwardly motioned for it to join me inside my humble apartment. It let itself in, creating and subsequently feeding itself through a thin, exoskeleton-esque tube, squeezing through the other end and blobbing out with a not quite audible squelch. Despite the disturbing image of the oozing Steve, for lack of a better word, slurping its tubing back into its gelatinous form, I offered it tea. Steve declined my offer by shaking its entire being, spreading a tar-like glooping mess that slowly ebbed into my carpet. Assuming that it was comfortable, and without the courage to ask, I sat next to it on the adjacent armchair. Once again, dreaded silence descended upon us, and, in a move unusual for Steve, at least in the few minutes I had known it, the being seemed to be voiceless, not as a result of its unending patience, but because it was collecting its thoughts. Conveying a soul more human than most politicians, although the question of whether a politician even contained a soul had been the subject of heated scientific debate for as long as we have had both politicians and science, Steve seemed to be at a loss for what to say. Still, what I lacked in patience, I more than made up for in pride. The ability to make even an all-powerful eldritch abomination squirm in its seat was what I would risk the chance of sudden and spontaneous termination to wait out. Although Steve didn't squirm, it only tensed in an unnatural bout of stillness, flesh pulled taut and, in its strain, somehow made more spherical. There was almost a sense of danger in the high-strung atmosphere, the pervasive premonition of an abrupt and immediate retirement from life. This time, unrelated to the fleeting nature of human existence, and instead entirely to do with the dark orb of crude power that daintily hovered to my right. It was an unexpected moment of terrifying clarity as I remembered what it was that had been oozing into my nice carpet. That the thing, anxiously silent above my couch, had not only the power to level whole cities, but to disintegrate entire superclusters. Suddenly, I had an overwhelming sympathy for this young golden retriever I had once seen at the beach, a sand-colored dot that had paddled too far out into the open water. The feeling was the curious realization that I was utterly and completely out of my depth. I said nothing. I couldn't have spoken, even if I wanted to. I was left mute, watching this somewhat endearing abomination fight a minor battle with its non-existent tongue in the same way I was struggling to motivate my own. Eventually, Steve, as the more powerful between us, laid the final blow and found its voice first. "You were human." It wasn't a question, although the growling tone made me instinctively doubt my own sense of self, a split-second rejection of the very logic that founded my identity, before, just as fast, I returned to my senses. I glanced at Steve, and it, without moving, turned back to me. "Weakly corporeal, short-lived, physically breakable. You have inferior mental capabilities, an unnecessary capacity for pain, and, as a species, you are riddled with neurosis and cruelty." Each word came like a blow. It felt like looking into a mirror, only for the glass itself to find you lacking. I agreed with the sentiment, it was the only logical conclusion, but that did not ease the discomfort. Steve was not done. In every way. I am superior. It did not speak from a place of ego, it just told me what it knew, and it knew far more than I. Still, Steve seemed troubled, emitting an aura of distress not unlike a child who was struggling to understand why they had to eat their broccoli, even though, as they had already explained, clearly and in varied volume, they had already consumed all of their carrots. The irritation that, even though their logic was sound, they were inevitably going to have to do something they didn't like. Steve, as an impossible force of monumental power, was likely unused to that ubiquitous feeling of helplessness. There was a moment of anticipation as it braced for its next remark. "I want to be human," it said, eventually, with the quality of a sigh, although no air visibly passed through it. While I wasn't sure if Steve was, in fact, hollow, I doubted that air would be masochistic enough to willingly fill the cavern. If it did, through some pitiful mistake, find itself within the void-filled chasm of Steve, I assumed that a sigh would be heard, if only as a mere consequence of the rushing scramble for escape. I commiserated with the fearful breeze, my hand tingling in sympathy as it was reminded of its brief but firm handshake with impenetrable doom. Distracted from my musings, I was rudely reacquainted with reality, which currently seemed a closer relative of some abstract and drug-addled dream than the tangible grip of the waking world. The absurdity of this preposterous being, floating indifferent above my couch, was only further intensified by the inconceivable desire of this all-powerful being to reduce itself to the drudgery of human inconvenience. I wanted to know why, or at least how, this desire came to be, but asking directly felt a little too callous, so instead I took it in stride. If I stopped to ask questions about every minute detail of a primordial entity's sudden appearance in my living room, my landlady would have to spend her afternoon scraping fragments of brain from the ceiling, either through fault of my own overthinking or the violent intervention of an ancient creature who is vexed by my incessant inquisition. I'm not Spanish, and even if I was, intangible presences probably don't get nostalgia for 52-year-old TV programs, so I probably wouldn't have fared any better. Thus, I said nothing. I absorbed all that Steve had to say, like a sympathetic crash mat. I offered no opinions of my own. Doubtless it heard the unvoiced words all the same as the voiced ones. Although Steve itself did not have much to say, because while some people have a flair for the dramatic, Steve had a flair for the brief and succinctly elegant. Unfortunately, Steve's fondness for brevity meant that we were once more coddled by the ice-cold earmuffs of silence. It was uncomfortable. As though we were two strangers with a mutual friend, a friend who had abandoned us to use the bathroom, left us to our own devices with not a trowelful of common ground, and not one of those adult-sized trowels either, one of those brightly coloured plastic ones that kids take to the beach, the real tiny ones that snap if you even look at them wrong. Like two actors with no chemistry preparing for a kiss, there was an underlying want to impress, overshadowed by a pessimistic sense of dread. Cowardice fueled my silence. I disliked cowardice. Why come to me? I'm only licensed to practice pediatric therapy, and, regardless of age, I've only ever worked with human patients. Surely there must be someone else more qualified. My words hung, like a line of criminals in times gone by, filling the air with whispers of colonious rule and capital punishment. Steve let them swing, appearing to consider their effect, although it felt more like a pretense for my sake than any real examination on its part. No, was its final answer, succinct to a fault. I shifted uneasily, unprepared for the blatant candor. Steve was very frank, I reflected humorously. You are human. Steve repeated itself, less like a broken record and more like the disappointed parent of a first grader who was struggling his way through the word hungry in the Hungry Hungry Caterpillar. There was an underlying frustration there that told me of some nuance in the phrase that I did not understand. When Steve saw that I was not suddenly overcome with divine clarity, it tried again. You misinterpret, it murmured in dismay, bobbing as though it were praying for patience, although I don't know to who or what. I somehow doubted that my God would soothe its frustration with mortal incompetence, but considering the human condition of being an idiot 90% of the time and repentant for said idiocy the other 10%, they could probably find some solace in their mutual dissatisfaction with what man has to offer. Steve paused before continuing. You are the most human. In all realities, all physical or temporal locations, compared to any being within all of existence, you are more human. Steve told me as though I knew what to do with the information. How was I supposed to react to the news that, apparently, when compared to everything that exists, in every time that exists, I was so flamboyantly human that it clocked on the radar of an intangible and omnipotent being? Human is a taxonomic classification, not a competition. My lone claim to remarkability on a universal scale was that I was the best at being average, which I realized was an oxymoron, not that Steve had any regard for the irrationality which was chipping away at my crumbling sense of individualism. I don't understand. How do you qualify most human? A childish pout forming subtly behind my pleasant expression had me feeling much too deserving of the sudden condescension directed at me by Steve's fearsome ire. It appeared to have expected my response, blobbing impatiently, an immediate disregard for my question like a crescendo in the well-worn symphony of humiliation. Even when I was a young child, listening to my parents fight beyond the gossiping walls of anorexic plywood, I had never felt such a visceral sense of my own incompetence. I doubt my explanation would enlighten you any further, Steve said dismissively. All you must know is that you are, and that is how it is. Understand that I am speaking in imprecise terms. Your language leaves much to be desired, and I have been reliably informed that it is considered rude to just plant the necessary information into someone's head. The process often results in temporary insanity and less common, but less temporary, sudden heart failure," Steve explained, turning its words into a cold drawl, not dissimilar to the well-rehearsed warnings of a bored ride technician before Misty's mystical momentum machine was set to spring forth at blistering speeds, only otherwise found in peak hour traffic or a retirement home senior citizen marathon. "Keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times," it said. "If you feel like vomiting, please contain the spillage to one central location, preferably within the smallest surface area possible." I wanted to argue the point, but the threat of temporary insanity or permanent discontinuance of my being was a surprisingly effective deterrent, and I sensed an aura of smugness around Steve that told me it knew it too. There was a part of me that wanted to defy it anyway, but I promptly reminded that part that it was, in fact, an idiot, and I valued my life above petulant insolence for the sake of my petty ego. I let my shoulders relax, my tense fighting stance wilting into a posture of reluctant compliance. Steve, as a consequence of its omniscience, noticed and loosened its tight grip over its physical form to mirror my relenting slouch. From a static orb, it softened into a more malleable shape, ebbing and flowing in oozing chunks of a substance that simply could not be described, presuming you wanted something more complex than just the word black. "So," I let the word trail off on its own, meandering into a field of awkward eye contact. Steve didn't have eyes, but the point still stood. "What was it that you actually wanted me to do?" I asked the secreting mass, who, once again, was imbuing my living room carpet with an oozing solution of preternatural waste. I wondered, most likely in vain, if bleach could remove the splotches left by the gore of the occult. At the very least, it would decidedly test the definition of tough within the phrase tough stains. Steve, unrelenting in its slow trickle of bloody grime, hesitated. It seemed that it, at its core, had the same plan of action that I did, which was none whatsoever. To be honest, I didn't believe that anyone, eldritch or otherwise, could be truly equipped with the necessary expertise to facilitate the induced transition from an intangible but invincible power incarnated within an ancient horror to the fleshy meat sack of constant burden that was the human form. But even so, it would have been nice for Steve to have had the common decency to, at the very least, hand me a WikiHow article before thrusting me into the deep end of transcendental metamorphosis. Steve globbed unhappily, obviously dissatisfied with the lack of resolution. I winced as its troubled bobs splattered even more of the carpet in a blanket of vicious sludge. Even from its static position on the floor, the spreading layer of grime seemed to eye me maliciously, aware of the mammoth task that would be scrubbing it free from the excessively strong grip of poor-quality flooring. It was just my luck that my carpet would be the only one in the world to develop a Romeo complex. Of course, it would be my carpet alone that would replace yearning for congenial preteens for the lust of uneven dark patches and blackened stains, its very fibres allured only by the lilting call of the most labour-intensive blots. The slurry-esque residue paid no mind to my growing horror, simply content to nestle deeper into my rug. I mentally glared at it, knowing that it was a futile action, a silent staring competition that was unexpectedly interrupted as Steve spoke up. "We need to set off on a narratively compelling journey," came the abrupt revelation, although it illuminated little and only intensified my intolerance for the invasive confusion I had been swaddled in. The itching cloth of bewilderment only bound tighter with every subsequent declaration. Sensing my dwindling patience, Steve explained. "I am aware of all human literature, a keen majority of it structured to explore the intricacies of the human condition. If, as a species, you have even the tiniest fleck of decent insight, your literature should reflect that inherent humanism in a way that is realistically applicable. Therefore, the prevalence of the adventure genre, especially trial via adversity, indicates that a narratively compelling journey is an effective method of humanization." Steve spoke slowly, shaking off the gravelly tone in which it had introduced itself. I hummed in assent, making a noise not unlike a particularly agreeable harmonica. Still, Steve was not satisfied. It occurred to me then that it had intended for us to leave right that second. Not that its intentions were any kind of motivator. My jeans were standing on their last legs in their third consecutive day of use, and I hadn't showered, let alone shaved. I was decidedly unready for some spiritual awakening in the Alps. I wasn't even decent enough to check the mailbox. Unfortunately, that choice was forcefully taken from me as my physical form was suddenly and distinctly somewhere else. Feeling mildly dizzy and more than a little ill, I took a moment to grasp my bearings. It was abruptly very warm, and the ground beneath my feet felt too suspiciously sand-like to be my ooze-covered carpet. To my right, Steve remained steadfast, its presence more irritating than comforting, although my cognizance of its eternal blobbing faded into the background as I was overcome with a morbid sort of dread. Steve was a distant speck in my thoughts as I gazed upon the barren horizon, a monotonous eternity that laid itself out before me. It was a landscape from the mind of the world's most uninteresting painter, a plain flat of cream-coloured sand underneath a cloudless sky. It was unnatural in its perfection, and I had an instant and profound realization that I would not enjoy whatever it was that came next. With little choice in the matter, my legs had taken a strike when faced with the weight of my dropping stomach. I sat down. Sand clung to my grimy jeans, which, apparently, Steve wasn't able to clean, despite having the power to teleport us here in an act so instantaneous that it made quantum entanglement jealous. "What the hell?" I yelled, throwing handfuls of sand in angry streams of billowing gold. "Be careful. The soil here is carcinogenic," Steve responded with no indication that it had heard my outburst. I turned to glare at it, slamming my hands into the ground just to be defiant, the action a calculated mistake as rolling puffs of smoke like dust enveloped whatever was in my immediate range of vision. Covering my mouth, I tried not to breathe in any of the supposedly cancer-giving particles, but the spinning grains of dirt were apathetic to my aching lungs' hunger for oxygen. They pestered me like an invasive aunt at Christmas dinner, and even I would be loath to omit that cancer was a significantly worse gift than ugly socks. I cursed the sky above and the ground below. Beyond that, there wasn't much left to curse, as defeat pushed me flat onto the ground, forcing me to breathe in laborious gasps. Like a tired vacuum cleaner, I sucked in air and dirt alike. My esophagus effectively turned into 1 billion grit sandpaper. The swirling dust didn't dare irritate as I hoovered it in greedily, sand so fine that it bypassed the security of my bronchi and instead embedded itself directly into the mucus lining of my lungs. Filled with a mounting sense of helplessness and a fair portion of carcinogenic soot, I almost dared the cancer to try. There were several questions I wanted to ask, each one more pressing than the last, begging to be chosen like that one overeager student in biology. They danced around in my brain, singing a sour melody of wrath and awe in equal measure. The most immediate of my concerns, beyond the persistent mantra of, "I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die," was the possibility of return. "Where are we?" I asked, not really expecting a straight answer. Steve's responses so far had been so not straight, they would have made a pride flag with scoliosis drool with unadulterated envy. Steve blobbed for a moment, not eyeing me carefully. I don't know," it said uncomfortably, a sound of bone-chilling horror to my ears. There were 3 words that made me more nervous than "I love you" on a first date or "defendant is guilty" after the first date. In that moment, any other 3 words would have been preferable. Even "you will die" was an improvement, as it had the same implication, just the decency to state it outright. I looked up to Steve, in a moment of half shock, half indignation, too overwhelmed to process any more than 2 base psychological states. As I silently stared at it, I felt the dark flavor of my reaction beginning to develop complexity. Layer by layer, like a cake that needed therapy. At first there was dread, then there was an empty kind of humor, and finally a deep, intense breed of anger. With a subtle undertone of perverse amusement, I was consumed by this profound bitterness, teetering on the edge of violent fury. It boiled and bubbled and spat, burning the very fabric of my soul. It was to my own surprise, then, that I was spurred into laughter. The noise was not anything like the gentle anthem of joy that I had previously known to be a laugh, nor was it like the silent lilt that tended to bend one over in overwhelming hilarity, unable to breathe and, in all likelihood, incredibly inebriated. The pitch was a gruesome echo of joy, a peal of sinister despair. It was a thundering shout that could only be found in the throat of a man who had nothing left to lose. Sick and twisted, it was a noise that had skinned cheer and forced it to waltz like some grisly marionette. This was not laughter, nor was it laughter's equal. It could barely be called laughter's mutilated corpse. Both sounds might have been founded in the absurd, but this broken cry had none of the goodwill that characterized innocent humor. "What do you mean you don't know?" I screeched, unable to convey how inexplicably ridiculous I found the current situation. The question was undercut by an ominous guffaw, my throat expelling a sound as cancerous as its gritty lining, acting of its own accord as my head struggled to catch up. My brain could not be blamed for its laggard pace, its very neurons slowed by the task of comprehending the ludicrous incongruities presented to me as fact. It was an impressive feat just resisting the tantalizing temptation of simply rejecting what my eyes and ears reported. It would be effortless to bunker away until this impossible hallucination finally dissipated. Steve, and every terrible thing it brought with it, evaporating into nothing, reborn into little more than a bewildered afterthought, its terrifying chaos gone, like the quickly vanishing haze of a particularly unconventional dream. Steve, much to my dismay, did not take the hint to vanish into a comical puff of smoke, remaining obnoxiously in existence despite my petulant glare. "I do not know where we are, because, as of 2 minutes ago, where we are didn't exist, it told me, hovering tentatively over my shoulder. Left with nothing else to give, I let out a final sigh of resignation, a singular breath that conveyed a wide selection of internal struggles. Like the last thrash of a gazelle in the jaws of a lion, I stared death in the eyes and, in what was probably the bravest moment of my life, faced his scythe with only 4 words to defend me. The simple question of, why the hell not? Death likely wouldn't have expected it from me, a quiet suburban soul who, as a boy, had never been of much interest to anyone but his parents, and, as a man, had not even them. The Grim Reaper probably wouldn't have remembered to collect me, had it not been marked so clearly on his list. Circled in red, Nathaniel Brown, it was underlined twice and adjacent to a small note in crimson ink. "Try not to forget this one," it said. "It's very easy to do," written in a looping font, dutifully accompanied by 3 exclamation marks. No, Death could not have predicted that I would someday stand defiantly before it, brandishing my unarmored fists as I, for the very first time, dared him to do his worst, that I would finally rise, uncowed and dauntless, for the simple reason that I couldn't care anymore. What else was there for me? What use was mourning when everything was gone? Freedom tasted more acrid than I had imagined. "So, what are we supposed to do?" I asked Steve. It was probably the last sentient being I would ever see, and it didn't even have a face to look into. Although it did seem to be unsettled by my sudden change in attitude, a fact I relished, widening my grin so that it dipped further into the manic craze that I felt inside. Steve globbed a few feet away, giving me a wide berth as if it was suddenly unsure that humans were as harmless as they first appeared. A reoccurring sentiment within human literature is that a physical adventure is reflective of the internal journey. The struggles of the corporeal form create a symbolic depiction of the mental and spiritual struggles, both of which a character must overcome. It began wearily, hesitantly hovering closer. When it saw that I was not going to randomly ambush it, a spontaneous act of violence somehow unseen by its omnipresence, it continued. "To put it bluntly, I think we should just walk forwards and see what happens." It was as good a plan as any, and I, supported by this newfound nihilism, had no reason to object. In my very first active display of agency, I marched forth, for once, ahead of Steve. And thus comes the end of Chapter 1. Hopefully Chapter 2 comes soon. If you liked it, please wait for that and subscribe so that you can get notifications to see when that happens. Bye.